week, we shift from purely studying the theories related to trade and also introduce the context of countries. The chapter covered in the textbook is Chapter 11. In this chapter, trade policy in developing regions is covered. The chapter is broadly divided into 4 parts. The first part introduces the most popular protectionist policies followed by developing countries. The first policy is import substitution, and the infant industry argument is one such an example. Despite the popularity of these arguments and instruments of trade policy, there are problems with these. We will discuss these problems in more detail under Section 2. Before moving on to this discussion on how trade liberalization has happened since 1985, we will also look at the South African case of import substitution. The final section of the chapter briefly discusses the economic development and growth of Asian countries and how they used international trade to achieve this growth. The main point of this chapter is that context of a country is key to its development and trade relations. Trade is impacted by the policies, followed by politics, histories, and customs of a country, while questions like why are countries poor or why do countries trade less is beyond discourse, and the debate still rages on these questions. The easiest but not only method of distinguishing between countries is level of income. After the Second World War, manufacturing was the main method used to develop economically. After this discussion on import substitution, you will also see the change that took place in trade policy in 1980. We will conclude with a brief description on the Asian miracle. The reason why this is a brief discussion relates to the first point made in this introduction, that it is very nuanced for each country. There are 3 main learning goals for this chapter. First, you should be able to discuss and evaluate the validity of import substitution as a trade policy and why it was historically popular for developing countries. The main import substitution tool is the infant industry argument. You should be able to summarize this argument from both a pro and cons case. The second, economic dualism, is where 2 systems or outcomes take place in the same system. You should know how this effect is integrated into international trade and provide examples of such economic dualism in international trade. You should be able to briefly discuss the Asian miracle of trade that serves as a counter to the infant industry and import substitution case. The first important question to ask is what exactly is import substitution? The answer is relatively simple. Import substitution is where a country decides to limit imports of manufactured goods, usually through tariffs, and replacing these imports with locally manufactured goods. The policy became popular after the Second World War because countries argued that if such a war or conflict broke out again, they needed to be self-sufficient. It is also supported at the time by some economic arguments like potential comparative advantage. Remind yourself what comparative advantage means in international trade. The main method of import substitution as discussed above is the infant industry argument. The argument states that developing countries have potential comparative advantages in manufactured goods. However, it argues that developing countries cannot compete internationally with large, already established developed countries' manufacturing. It then states that these industries need to be protected and given a chance to develop and become competitive. Remember to remind yourself continuously what comparative advantage in trade works and how it works theoretically. Historically, and another reason why it became popular among developing countries is that many now developed countries had these types of protections before the Second World War. There are three main problems and questions that need to be answered with relation to the infant industry argument. First, and importantly, are industries that are important today still going to be important in the future? Notoriously, governments are bad at selecting winners of industry. For example, do you select oil and coal as an infant industry today when most countries are moving towards green energy? Second question, are the protected industry experiencing growth and becoming more competitive? Protection should not just be given for protection's sake. The ultimate aim is economic development, and it should be asked if this is achieved. Third, is there another market failure that is causing the industry not to thrive? For example, if it is a profitable industry, why is it not already competing? Two prominent discussions of this market failure in developing countries are imperfect financial markets and appropriability that we will discuss later. The first market failure observed in developing countries, which is used for the infant industry argument, is imperfect capital markets. Efficient financial markets allocate funds and resources to the profitable industries. This can happen through either the stock market or through banks. While we have an efficient and stable stock market in South Africa, our banking sector plays a bigger role in the allocation of resources. If there is no efficient financial market, the question then becomes, should an efficient financial market be created, or should an industry be protected? The appropriability argument is how to cover the costs of industry when it starts. There are startup costs when a new industry starts. These costs do not only include the physical infrastructure that must be developed, but also the intangible assets like ideas and knowledge. How do you measure and pay for these startup costs? The main method of developing the comparative advantage in developing countries are to limit export. But what is a potential problem with this? Limiting imports also negatively affects exports. And why can exports not be promoted while imports are substituted? The answer why historically import substitution has been more popular is both economics and politics. There was skepticism about the ability of developing countries to compete on exports. A problem with import substitution was that it protected powerful and already established industries. In the 1950s and 1960s, developing countries further focused on the final stages of production like food processing, believing this will give them the highest return. However, developing countries never went beyond that to higher valued goods like computers. After 1960, it became clear that the expected benefits were not appearing in developing countries and that damage, like increased inequality, appeared. There are problems with import substitution, as well as by the end. The problems with import substitutions were clear by the end of the 1960s. First, developing countries were not catching up to developed countries like they were expected to. Developing countries faced more fundamental issues for not being competitive, like the lack of skills, education, and managerial experience. These problems are often exacerbated by the lack of supplies, from spare parts to electricity. Think load shedding. Should developing countries rather focus on these problems rather than selecting and protecting industries? Is it more important to be efficient? It is more important to be efficient rather than focusing on protecting industries. Without the benefits expected from the infant industries, the focus shifted to the cost of this protection, and it became clear that the benefits outweighed the cost in a free trade scenario rather than in a protectionist scenario. Before we move on to the opposite of protectionism and looking at free trade, let's discuss protectionism's history in South Africa. In South Africa, since the fall of apartheid, some form of protectionism has been used. The first and most notable is the Proudly South African campaign that encouraged buying local products rather than imported products. There are also two industries that were identified as infant industries, the motor industry and the clothing and textile industry. The motor industry was given protection in 1995 and has since grown to exporting over 350,000 cars, and the industry is worth about 150 billion. As recently as 2019, Mercedes-Benz invested in South Africa's car industry. This growth in the industry meant a reduction in the price of South African-produced cars, making them internationally competitive. And second, it reduced the waste in cost and materials in production. It is considered a success of infant industry and its related protection. The clothing and textile industry, on the other hand, was unable to structurally adjust like the car industry. The growth was similar. The industry was given similar protection after apartheid, but its export growth was not close to the success of the car industry, and since 2000 it has turned negative and employment in the industry has remained stagnant. Since 1985, the focus has been on trade liberalization, which includes the reduction in tariffs, removing import quotas, and generally freer trade. Trade as a share of GDP has tripled since then. Another aspect that changed with trade liberalization is the shift in focus in goods that are traded. Before 1985, export consisted mainly of mining and agricultural goods, while after 1985 it is manufactured goods. There is still debate about the trade's relationship with growth, which brings us back to our initial point. Context often matters. After the 1950s, economic successes arose in Asia, namely South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. More recently, China and India have joined that group of fast-growing economies, and more recently still, Vietnam. A common thread of these countries is decreased regulation in industry and generally freer trade. And it shows that import substitution is not the only solution. However, Latin American countries, despite freer trade, have not experienced the same economic growth levels, which shows the economic dualism of free trade. A question that remains is Africa. After most countries in Africa gained independence in the 1960s, the expectation was that it would be a fast-growing continent. The living standards in the 1960s were similar to that of China. That, however, the expected growth did not materialize, but it is changing again. An example of how you can see the changing fortunes of Africa is on the cover of the popular economics magazine The Economist between 2000 and 2013.